The first thing the crash smelled like was sulfur and cold stone. Oren noticed it the moment the heavy doors slid open behind him. He stood there for a second with his toolbox in one hand and a cleaning kit slung over his shoulder, taking in the long corridor ahead. The walls were black volcanic rock, carved smooth, lit by strips of amber light that ran along the floor. The ceiling was high enough that he could not see the top of it. Everything in the Drachari Dominion was built for beings larger than him. That was not a new feeling. He had grown up with it. A guard walked in front of him without looking back. Not an escort, more like someone walking a stray dog to a pen. The guard was tall, covered in dark green scales, with a ridge of bony spines running from the top of his skull down to the base of his neck. His tail moved when he walked. It was a small movement, like a habit he did not notice. Oren followed him. The creche was the most protected facility on the capital world. It housed 3 hatchlings, the children of High Warlord Dravan, who ruled more star systems than most humans could name. The regular maintenance crew had been pulled for a deep inspection rotation. The Drachari nurturer assigned to the hatchlings had fallen ill. That left a gap in the cleaning and maintenance schedule, and the Empire filled gaps with whatever labor was cheapest. That meant Oren. He had been working in the Dominion for 11 years, first as a pipe fitter on a refinery platform, then as a systems tech on a relay station, now as a general maintenance worker in whatever facility needed him. He was good at it. Not because the work was glamorous, it was not, but because he paid attention, he was patient, and he did not cut corners. Those were not celebrated qualities in the Dominion. They were just useful ones. The guard stopped in front of a wide chamber door, pressed a claw to the lock panel, and waited for it to open. Then he turned to Oren for the first time. "You do not speak to the hatchlings," the guard said. His voice was flat and low. "You do not make contact with them. You do not look at them directly unless they address you first. You do not touch them under any circumstances. You do your work and you stay in your assigned areas." Oren nodded. "Do you understand?" "Yes," Oren said. The guard held his gaze for a moment longer, as if checking whether Oren understood the weight of those words. Then he stepped aside. Oren walked in. The chamber was large and open. There were 3 sleeping platforms along the far wall, each fitted with thick stone bedding carved to hold a small dragon body. There was a training area to the left, marked by floor patterns and practice targets. There was a common area to the right, with carved benches and low tables that held books made of fire-treated material. The room was clean but hard. There was not much that was soft in it. The 3 hatchlings were there. The first one Oren saw was the largest of them. He was sitting on one of the benches with his arms crossed, looking at Oren with the specific kind of stare that powerful young things give to things they have not decided whether to crush yet. His scales were deep red, almost the color of old brick. His eyes were gold. He was the size of a large dog, though he sat like someone who had been told his whole life that he was enormous. The second one was sitting at the table with a book open in front of her, but she was not reading it. She was watching Oren from the side of her eye. Her scales were a cooler-colored dark gray with a faint silver edge. She had a careful, calculating stillness about her, the kind that comes from spending a lot of time watching and not much time speaking. The third one he almost missed. She was in the far corner, half behind a carved stone pillar, looking at the floor. Her scales were the palest of the 3, a dusty bronze. She was smaller than the other 2. She was very, very still, in the way that small things are still when they are hopping not to be noticed. Oren set his toolbox down on the maintenance ledge near the door, pulled out his cleaning kit, and got to work. He started with the floor near the entrance. The heating coils ran along the base of the walls, and some of the panel covers had mineral buildup around the joints. He made a note on his work pad and kept moving. The air filters in the ceiling vent above the training area needed to be cleared. He checked the pressure gauge on the water line behind the wall panel near the sleeping platforms. All of it was methodical, quiet work. He did not announce himself. He did not ask for attention. He just moved through the space the way he always did. The large red hatchling, the one on the bench, watched him for a while. Then he got up. He walked over slowly, the way a predator walks when it is still deciding whether something is worth its time. He stopped a few feet from Oren and looked down at him. Then he opened his mouth slightly and let out a short burst of flame. It hit the floor 2 inches from Oren's left boot. the stones scorched black in a small circle. Oren stopped. He looked at the scorch mark. He looked at his boot, which was fine. He reached into his kit, pulled out a cleaning cloth, and wiped the mark off the floor. Then he looked up at the hatchling. "You're going to have to do better than that to ruin my day, little one," he said quietly. The red hatchling stared at him. No one had ever said that to him, not the nurturers, not the guards, not the servants. Everyone who came into this room either feared the hatchlings or performed deep respect for them. This human had done neither. He had wiped up the scorch mark and called him Little One. Rail, for that was his name, though Oren did not know it yet, did not know what to do with that. He went back to his bench and sat down. He did not say anything. He just watched Oren continue working. Sora, the gray-scaled one, turned a page in her book that she was not reading. In the far corner, Dunn had looked up from the floor. The day ended. The guard came back and walked Oren out. He went to his bunk in the labor quarters, a small concrete room with a cot and a shelf. He ate a cold meal from his kit. Then he sat on the edge of the cot and pulled out a small photograph from his front pocket. It was worn at the edges, the image slightly faded. A woman with a warm face, short dark hair, and a smile that had taken him completely off guard the first time he saw it. He held the photograph for a while. He did not say much out loud, just the name, Lena. Then he set it carefully on the shelf, lay down, and stared at the ceiling until sleep came. In the creche, through the narrow vent great above the sleeping platforms, a small pair of dusty bronze eyes watched the dark corridor for a long time after the light went out. Dunn had followed him to the edge of the wing, slipping through the side passage the way she always did when no one was watching her. She had felt something when she used her empathy on the human, not the usual feelings she got from the guards: boredom, controlled authority, mild disgust at the assignment. Not the feelings she got from the nurturers: duty, careful distance, low-level resentment. What she had felt from the human was something older and heavier, like a stone that had been carried for a long time. Grief, she supposed, but not broken grief. Grief that had been folded neatly and put in a pocket, and that the person kept going anyway. She did not have a word for what that made her feel. She went back to her sleeping platform and lay down in the dark. She did not sleep for a long time. 3 days passed before any of them spoke to him directly. It was not that they ignored him. It was the opposite. They watched him the way a creature watches something it cannot quite categorize, too small to be a threat, too calm to be afraid, not performing respect, not flinching, not trying to make itself invisible, just present, moving through the room with its cleaning cloth and its tools and its quiet sounds, like water moving through stones, steady and unhurried. Sora was the first to break. She had been watching him clean the filter housing above the training area for almost 20 minutes. He had to stand on a folding step to reach it. He worked carefully, loosening the cover, pulling out the mesh filter, tapping it clean against the wall, wiping the inside of the housing. It was not complicated work. It was very repetitive. He did not seem to mind. She stood up from her bench and crossed the room. "Those tools are inefficient," she said. Oren glanced down at her, then back at the filter. "For some jobs, yes. A Drachari engineer would use a vibropulse cleaner for that component. It takes 4 seconds. "I don't have one of those," Oren said. He tapped the filter against the wall again and checked it against the light. "What I've got works fine, just takes longer." Sora watched him slot the filter back into the housing. "How do you know the angle is correct?" "There's a notch here," he said, pointing at a small ridge on the inner frame. "When the filter seats right, you can feel it click, like this." He pressed the cover back on. A small click. He stepped down from the step. Done. Sora looked at the housing. She had lived in this room for most of her life and had never once looked at that component. It had simply worked or it had not, and when it had not, a technician came. She had not considered that there was a physical reason it worked. A notch, a click, something mechanical and honest. "You know a great many things about unimportant systems," she said. "Keeping the air clean doesn't seem unimportant to me," Oren said, picking up his step. "It is labor work." "Yes. You are not bothered by that." He looked at her for a moment. She had a precise, probing quality in her voice, like she was testing the tension of a wire. Not unkind, exactly, just clinical. "No," he said simply, and moved on to the next task. Sora stood there for a moment, then she went back to her bench, but she did not open her book. She watched him for the rest of the hour. Rael waited until the afternoon. He came at Oren differently, not with questions, but with the posture of someone who expected the world to rearrange itself around his presence. He planted himself directly in Oren's path, while Oren was moving cleaning supplies from one side of the room to the other. "You are not afraid of me," Rael said. It came out as a statement, but it was really a question. Oren stopped, set the supplies down, looked at Rael with the same level expression he used for everything. "No," he said. "Every being in this facility is afraid of us. I believe you. But you are not." Oren thought about it for a moment. Not a performing kind of pause, the actual kind where someone is actually thinking. "I've been afraid of a lot of things," he said. "Reactor misfires, pressure leaks in deep space pipe systems, losing someone." He picked up the supplies again. "But you're a kid. Being afraid of a kid would just be embarrassing." Rael's jaw tightened. "I am the heir of High Warlord Draven. I am not a child." "You're young enough to flame blast the floor to get a reaction from a maintenance worker," Oren said, without any edge in his voice. "That's a kid thing to do." Rael had no answer for that. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to him, and it landed somewhere inside him that he could not immediately identify. He stood there for another second. Then he turned and walked to the other side of the room, because standing there any longer felt like losing something, and he did not know what. He sat down on his training mat and tried to read. He did not absorb a single word. He was thinking about what Oren had said, not because it made him angry, because it was accurate. And accuracy, his father had taught him, was the foundation of strength. Dunn had not spoken to Oren yet. She was not sure she could. But she had started leaving things. The first one was a small stone, bright orange, almost perfectly round, the kind she had found in the training yard 2 seasons ago and kept in her sleeping nook because the weight of it felt good in her palm. She placed it near the maintenance ledge one morning, right where Oren's toolbox usually sat before he arrived. When he came in, he noticed it. She watched him from her corner. He looked at the stone for a moment, then picked it up, turned it over once in his hand, and set it on the windowsill, the narrow one above the heating coil, where the light came in strong in the afternoon and made everything glow. He did not say anything about it. He did not look around the room to see who left it. He just put it somewhere it could be seen and went to work. The next day she left a piece of crystal she had chipped off the far wall when Vorath was not looking. Then a small carved token she had made herself from a piece of softwood. One of the serving staff had left behind a rough shape, not quite a dragon, not quite anything else, just a shape that had pleased her when it was finished. Each time, Oren put the thing on the windowsill without comment. By the end of the week, there was a small collection there: the stone, the crystal, the carved token, and a dark feather she had found in the outer courtyard. Oren had arranged them without being asked. Stone first, then crystal, then the token in the middle. The feather leaned against the stone. It looked intentional, like someone's idea of a small, quiet display. On the 5th afternoon, Dunn was alone in the far room off the main chamber. The others were in a language instruction session with one of the approved tutors. She had been excused because of a recurring stomach complaint that was part real and part useful. She was lying on the cool floor with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. She was having a bad morning. The dream had come back, the one where her father stood in the center of the creche and looked at all 3 of them in a line, and his gaze moved from Rael to Sora and stopped. Just stopped. Like there was nothing left to look at, like she was not there. She was still shaking a little when Oren came in to check the back wall pipe access. He saw her, he stopped. He looked at the guard station down the hall and then back at her. He did not call for anyone. He crossed the room slowly, not quickly, and sat down on the floor about an arm's length from her, not close enough to feel like pressure, just close enough to be present. Then he started talking. His voice was low and easy. He talked about a pipe fitting he had done that morning on the lower level, a corrosion patch on a copper joint that had been weeping slowly for weeks. He talked about the type of sealant he used and why, and how if you applied it too thick it would crack, and if you applied it too thin it would not hold, and how the balance was something you could only really learn by doing it wrong a few times first. He talked about the way the pipe had made a small settling sound after the seal dried, like it was relaxing. It was not a dramatic story, it was not meant to be. But his voice was very steady, and he did not treat her shaking as a problem to be solved or a symptom to be reported. He just sat there and talked, and slowly, the way cold water warms when you cup it in your hands long enough, her breathing settled. She looked at him. "Are you not disgusted by weakness?" she asked. He looked back at her with a genuinely confused expression, like she had said something in a language he did not speak. "You were scared," he said. "That's not weakness, that's just being alive." Dunn sat with that for a long moment. The shaking had stopped. Oren got up after another minute, brushed off his trousers, picked up his kit, and went to check the pipe access panel. In the doorway, Sora stood with her arms at her sides. She had come back early from the instruction session. She had heard most of it. Her expression was unreadable, the careful blank face she had trained herself to keep. But her tale was very still, and stillness in a Drachari was not calm. It was the opposite. It was the moment before a decision. She did not say anything. She turned and walked back to the main chamber. But she did not forget a single word. It started with a sound. A low groan came from somewhere inside the south wall, the kind of sound that old systems make when something is asking for attention it has not been getting. Oren heard it from the maintenance corridor. He stopped walking, tilted his head, listened. Most people would have kept going. He had learned a long time ago that walls do not groan for no reason. He put his palm flat against the panel. The vibration came through faintly, a slow shudder, like a pulse that was not quite right. He checked his work pad. The south wall carried the main heating line for the creche, the primary pipe system that kept the chamber temperature stable. Young Drachari were cold-blooded in their early years. Heat was not comfort for them, it was survival. He knocked on the panel 3 times in different spots and heard the sound change in the third spot, slightly hollow where it should have been solid. Pressure buildup. Either the line was partially blocked or the intake valve was failing. He opened the access hatch with his key tool. Inside, the pipe was sweating. That was bad. The condensation on a sealed heat line meant the internal pressure was already dropping somewhere upstream. He pulled out his reader and ran a scan. The valve housing on junction 4 was cracked, not broken through, cracked. It was weeping pressure slowly, and the temperature on the other side of it was already 2 degrees lower than the baseline. 2 degrees was a number that did not sound serious. In a room with 3 hatchlings who could not regulate their own body heat yet, it was a countdown. He hit the comm panel on the wall and reported the failure to the facility officer. Drachari engineers were contacted. They were on rotation in the outer ring 40 minutes out, minimum. The facility officer came to the corridor and looked at the hatch, and then at Oren. "Can you hold it?" the officer asked. "I can try," Oren said. The officer gave an order to the other staff to move portable heaters into the main chamber. Then he started giving more orders that contradicted the first ones. Oren stopped listening to the orders. He pulled his toolbox to the hatch and looked at what he had. He did not have the correct replacement valve. The facility stores held Drachari spec parts, and the fittings were a different gauge than his human-rated tools. He had a sealant compound, 3 clamp types, a pressure gauge, a pipe cutter, 2 lengths of flexible conduit left over from an earlier job, and the kind of calm that comes from having fixed things in worse situations. He started working. The first thing he needed was a way to relieve the pressure on the cracked housing without breaking it through. He rigged a bypass using one of the flexible conduit lengths, clamping it across the junction to let flow divert while he worked on the housing itself. It took him 8 minutes to get the clamp seated correctly. The first 2 attempts were wrong. The Drachari fittings were slightly larger than his clamp heads, and the seal was not true. He adjusted. He tried again. The third attempt held. His hands were starting to warm from the heat, bleeding through the pipe surface. He kept working. The hatchlings were in the main chamber with the portable heaters. They had been told to stay there. Rail had ignored that instruction within 4 minutes. He stood at the entrance to the maintenance corridor, watching Oren work through the open hatch. He did not come closer, he just watched. He saw was this, a creature that was smaller than him, with no scales, no claws, no flame, crawling halfway into a wall to fight a failing pipe system with tools that did not quite fit the job. The human was not graceful. His first clamp failed. His second clamp failed. He adjusted without frustration, without sound, and tried again. When the third one held, he made a small satisfied noise that was not pride, it was just acknowledgement. He moved immediately to the next problem. The pipe itself was the harder issue. The cracked section of the valve housing had to be reinforced, or the bypass would fail when the main engineers arrived and restored full pressure. Oren cut a sleeve from the second conduit length and used the sealant to bond it over the crack, pressing it firm and holding it with both hands for 3 full minutes. The pipe was hot enough that it was uncomfortable. He held it anyway. His forearm touched the edge of a secondary pipe during the second minute, a short, sharp sting. He pulled his arm back slightly but did not let go of the seal. He could see a red mark rising on his skin. He kept holding. When the 3 minutes were done, he released the seal, checked it, tapped it, checked the pressure gauge. The reading was climbing back. The bypass was working. The reinforced crack was holding. He sat back on his heels in the maintenance corridor and let out a long breath. Sora had appeared behind Rail at some point. She was looking over his shoulder. The facility officer arrived minutes later, saw the readings, and immediately began speaking loudly about how the situation had been managed. He used words like "my assessment" and "standard protocol." Oren started cleaning up his tools. He put the leftover conduit back in his bag. He filed his work pad notes on the repair. He did not say anything about what the officer was telling the arriving engineers. The engineers arrived and checked the work. One of them, a heavyset Drachari with yellow eyes, crouched at the hatch and looked at the bypass rig and the sealed housing for a long moment. He ran a scanner over it. "Human work," he said. "Yes," the officer said, without crediting Oren specifically. The engineer looked at the rig again. "It's not standard," he said, "but it's solid." He stood up. "We'll put in the proper parts. This'll hold until we're done." He moved off without another word. Oren closed his toolbox. Rail was back in the main chamber by the time Oren came through. He was on his training mat, sitting very still. Oren walked past him toward the equipment ledge. "You burned your arm," Rail said. Oren glanced down. The red mark was still visible below his rolled sleeve. "A little, it's fine." Rail looked at the mark. "You did not stop." "No. The pipe would have failed." "Yes." Rail was quiet for a moment. "You held it for 3 minutes." "Needed to," Oren said. He shouldered his kit. "That's how sealant works." Rail did not have a follow-up. He watched Oren walk to the equipment ledge and start logging the repair. The gold eyes tracked every movement. He had been raised to understand strength as size, fire, dominance, the weight of presence that made others step back. He had been shown power in battle simulations, in history lessons about his father's campaigns, in the formal size of the warlord's seat, and the lowered eyes of every being who entered the hall. He did not have a word, in any language he had been taught, for what he had just watched. A being that had no natural advantage, no physical power, no proper tools, who had tried twice and failed, and adjusted and tried again, and held a hot pipe with a burning arm until the problem was solved. Not because someone was watching, not because there was glory in it, because the alternative was that 3 young dragons got cold. He sat on the mat for a long time after Oren left. Sora came to him later in the evening, which she did not do often. "He did something competent today," she said, in the careful tone she used when she was saying something she had been thinking about for a while. Yes, Rail said. I did not expect that. Rail thought about the bypass rig, the improvised clamps, the sealant held in both hands for 3 minutes. I did not either, he said. They sat in silence for a while, which was also not something they did often. In the corner, Dunn was already asleep, or close to it, but before she closed her eyes, she looked at the windowsill where Oren had arranged her small collection, the stone, the crystal, the token, the feather, and she thought about the red mark on his forearm and the way he had said that's how sealant works, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. She thought he was possibly the strangest creature she had ever met. She thought she meant that as the best thing she had ever said about anyone. On the other side of the facility, in the maintenance bunk room, Oren was wrapping his arm with a strip of medical tape from his kit. It was not deep. It would be fine by morning. He ate his cold meal and sat on the edge of his cot and looked at the photograph on the shelf. Still here, he said quietly, to the photograph, to himself, to no one. He lay down and slept without dreaming. Rain came to the capital world in long grey sheets that turned the volcanic plains into mirrors. Oren could see it through the high window in the main chamber while he worked on the upper ventilation housing. The window was narrow and set deep into the stone, the kind of window that was built to let in light rather than a view. But from where he stood on his step, he could see a wide enough strip of sky to watch the rain coming down hard and sideways. It was the kind of day that made everything feel slower. Dunn was the only hatchling in the room. Rail had a combat instruction session. Sora was with a political tutor. Dunn had been excused from language study that morning because Vorath, the creche supervisor, had observed her falling asleep during the previous session and decided rest was more efficient than drilling a tired hatchling. Vorath made decisions the way she did everything practically, with no emotion attached. Dunn was sitting cross-legged on the floor near the windowsill where her small collection lived. She was not doing anything. She was just sitting, looking at the stone and the crystal and the carved token Oren had arranged there. She touched the token once with the tip of one claw, lightly. Oren climbed down from the step and moved it to the side. He glanced at her the way he always did, just a quick check, not a stare. "You made that one?" he asked, nodding at the token. Dunn looked up. "Yes. It's good work." She looked at it again, as if she was seeing it through a different window. "It was the third one I tried. The first two broke." "Third one held, though," Oren said. She did not answer that directly, but something in her posture settled slightly, like a knot loosening by 1 degree. Oren went to his kit for a different tool. He worked quietly for a few minutes. Dunn watched him the way she always watched, without seeming to, from a sideways angle. Then she asked, "What is in the photograph?" Oren stopped. He turned to look at her. She was looking at him directly now, which she did not often do. Her pale bronze eyes were steady. She had clearly been building toward the question for a while. He crossed the room and sat down on the bench near her, not close, just near. He reached into his front pocket and took out the photograph. He looked at it for a second, then turned it so she could see. It was a woman, dark hair cut short, a round face, eyes that were looking at whoever was holding the camera with an expression like she knew something good that she was keeping to herself. She was wearing a coat that was a little too big for her, and behind her was a railing and a grey sky that looked like a different planet's grey. "Her name was Lena," Oren said. Dunn looked at the photograph for a long time. "Was," she said, careful and exact, the way Sora had taught her to catch the weight of words. "She died 14 months ago," he said. "We were on a colony, a smaller one. When the Dominion expanded into that sector, the colony was reclassified. Everybody moved. We ended up in a transit settlement for a while. We met there." Dunn was still looking at the photograph, and then she died. "She got sick," he said. "There are good medical facilities in the Dominion. Not for everyone, though. We were workers, labor category. The care you get depends on what classification you hold." He paused. He was not saying it with anger. He was saying it the way he said most things, straight and level, like a measurement. By the time she was sick enough that we knew something was wrong, it was already far along. They could have treated it early. They didn't catch it early. Dunn was quiet for a moment. "Why do you still carry the image?" she asked. "She is gone. The data is inefficient to retain in physical form. You could store it in a digital archive and access it when needed." Oren looked at the photograph in his hand. He was quiet for longer than usual. Not the kind of quiet that meant he was uncomfortable, but the kind that meant he was finding the right words for something that did not have a simple shape. "Because when I look at it, I remember that she was real," he said, "that what we had was real. If I put it away, if it goes into an archive, behind a screen, something I have to navigate to, it starts to feel like storage, like something filed and finished." He turned the photograph over once in his hand, then back. "If I put it away, it feels like I'm agreeing that it didn't matter anymore, and it mattered. It was the most important thing I ever had." Dunn stared at him. She had empathy that most adult Drachari could not match. She had been reading feelings since before she could speak. She had read the guards, their professionalism and their low contempt. She had read the nurturers, their careful detachment. She had read Rail and Sora every day of her life, all the ambition and the calculation and the buried soft things they did not admit to. She had read Oren from the first day, the steady low grief, the patience, the deep tiredness under the steadiness. But she had kept herself at a distance from it. She had felt the edge of it, like standing near a fire and feeling the warmth without being inside the flame. Now she opened up fully. She was not even deciding to do it. It just happened because he had answered her honestly, and the answer was too real to look at from a distance. The grief that she felt from him was enormous. It was not the kind that destroyed a person. It was not wild or loud. It was the weight of something that had mattered completely and was now gone, and he had folded it up and put it in his pocket and kept going to this room, to this job, to the cold meal in the bunk room, to the next day and the next one. The grief was there in everything he did. It was why he was so steady, she understood suddenly, because he had already survived the worst thing. Everything else was just work. She started crying. It happened before she could stop it. She was not a creature who cried. It was trained out of them. Early weakness was not displayed, not in a warlord's household, not in the creche. But her eyes filled, and the tears came, and she could not find the place inside her where the stop valve was. Oren did not say anything. He did not make a face or look uncomfortable or call for anyone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded cloth, a handkerchief, clean and plain, and held it out toward her. She looked at it, she picked it up carefully, she pressed it to her eyes. He turned slightly away, not all the way, just enough to give her a small wall of privacy. When she had finished, she held the cloth in both hands and looked at it. It was a human thing, small and practical and clean. She did not know what to do with the feeling she had now, the one that did not have a Drachari word for it. "I am sorry about Lena," she said. "Thank you," Oren said simply. She handed the cloth back. He pocketed it. Neither of them said anything else. Oren got up after another minute and went back to work. Dunn sat with the collection on the windowsill and the rain outside and the very large feeling that had nowhere to go yet. Sora came back to the chamber an hour later. She walked in, saw the look on Dunn's face, looked at Oren working at the far wall, and arrived at a conclusion without needing to be told. She was good at that. She went to her room and closed the door behind her. She sat on the edge of her sleeping platform and opened her mind the way she had been taught a political mind, a mind for calculation, for outcomes and positions and leverage. She ran the same calculation she always ran when something did not fit. She went looking for where it led. The Dominion's expansion into Sector 7, the colony displacement figures, the transit settlement populations, the health classification system for labor category beings, the treatment access rates, the outcome data for treatable conditions caught late because labor category beings were not given early screening. She had access to all of this information. She had been educated in the structure of the empire as part of her political preparation. The numbers were all there. She had looked at them before as administrative data, as context. She looked at them now as something else. She sat alone in her room for a long time. Across the creche, Rail came back from combat instruction to find Dunn quietly sitting, Sora behind a closed door, and a human maintenance worker refinishing a wall panel with steady hands. He looked at all three of these things in sequence. He went to the archive console and pulled the expansion records for Sector 7. He read for 2 hours. He did not speak to anyone. Near the end of it, he stood up and hit the console with the flat of his palm. Not hard, not a tantrum, a single measured impact, like punctuation at the end of a sentence. He left the room. The console screen stayed on, the records still open. Outside, the rain continued to fall, long and grey, on a world that had never once asked the people who lived on it whether they wanted to be here. The notice came on a Tuesday. Vorath delivered it at morning assembly. She stood at the front of the chamber in her grey administrative robes, her tail folded neatly behind her, her expression the same as it always was, completely flat, like a surface that had been sanded until nothing caught the light. She announced 3 things: a change in the afternoon instruction schedule, a new dietary protocol for Rail following his growth assessment, and then, without any pause or change of tone, the maintenance assignment rotation will conclude at the end of this week. Worker Oren will be reassigned to the deep labor facility on the 3rd orbital platform. A Drachari-rated maintenance crew will take over facility operations. She folded her hands in front of her. Are there questions regarding the instruction schedule? There were no questions. She left. The 3 hatchlings sat in the chamber after she was gone. For a moment, none of them moved or spoke. The silence in the room was the specific kind that happens when something has been said that is still settling, like an object dropped from a height that has not yet hit the floor. Rail stood up. He did not make an announcement. He went to the archive console, pulled up the facility operating manual, and started reading. Anyone watching him would have seen the same look on his face that he wore during combat drills, focused, deliberate, with an economy of movement that meant he was saving himself for what came next. He spent 40 minutes reading legal text. The Drachari Dominion had a formal labor code that most Drachari did not bother to learn because most Drachari were not workers. Rail had been educated in imperial law as part of his political preparation: treaties, territorial codes, military statutes. The labor code was a peripheral section that he had skimmed during his studies and set aside as irrelevant. He read it fully now for the first time. He found what he was looking for in Section 14 of the Standing Labor Protection Articles. Any being in the service of an imperial facility who demonstrated proven competence in a critical system intervention that prevented material harm to imperial assets or persons could be petitioned by the ranking occupant of that facility for protected laborer designation. The petition had to be filed formally, had to cite the specific incident and applicable provision, and had to be submitted before a reassignment order took effect. A hatchling of the warlord's house was a ranking occupant of the creche. He filed the petition that afternoon. He cited the heating system failure. He cited the specific pipe work, the temperature readings before and after, the engineer's assessment that the repair was solid, and the fact that without the intervention, the main chamber temperature would have dropped to a level that could have caused harm to the creche's occupants. He wrote it cleanly and precisely. He used no emotional language. He made a strategic argument in the only terms imperial administration understood. Then he sent it. He sat back in his chair. His claws tapped once on the console surface. He did not look pleased with himself. He looked like someone who had just put the correct piece in the correct place and was already thinking about the next one. Sora had disappeared into her room immediately after the morning assembly. She had been in there for most of the day. She came out in the late afternoon and found Rail at the console. She looked at his screen long enough to see what he had filed. She said nothing about it. She went back to her room. She had been working on something of her own, and she had started it 3 days before the announcement. She had noticed Vorath watching Oren more carefully than usual. She had noticed the facility officer filing additional reports. She was the kind of person who noticed those things the way others notice movement in their peripheral vision, not because she was looking for it, but because her mind had been built to catch it. She had spent those 3 days quietly drafting a formal political inquiry, addressed to the Dominion Council, under her own name as heir to a warlord's house. The inquiry requested a formal review of the efficiency and ethical standing of the deep labor reassignment system for specialist workers. It questioned whether the practice of removing proven technical labor from high-functioning assignments and moving them to extraction facilities represented optimal use of Dominion labor resources. It cited efficiency data, it cited output comparisons, it cited long-term operational cost modeling. She did not mention Oren anywhere in it. She did not have to. What she had done was place a formal council inquiry in the administrative record, reassigning a specific worker to the deep labor facility during an active council inquiry about that exact practice would flag the reassignment in the review. It would draw attention to it. It would create a paper record that connected the reassignment to the inquiry in a way that would require explanation. She sent the inquiry through official channels, stamped with her formal designation. It arrived in the council record that evening. She did not tell Rael what she had done. He did not tell her what he had done. They sat at dinner on opposite sides of the table and ate in silence, which was not unusual, except that it was a different kind of silence than usual. Dunn had done nothing bureaucratic. She had no access to legal codes or council channels. She was 8 years old in human equivalence, and she had no formal authority and no political tools. She had done the only thing she knew how to do. She found Oren in his bunk room. She had slipped through the staff corridor past the guard rotation during shift change, which took 12 minutes and required her to be very small and very quiet, both of which she was already very good at being. She stood in the open doorway of the bunk room and looked in. Oren was at the small shelf. His back was to her. He was packing. Not much. His kit bag was half the size of what it would take to hold anything significant. He had his work clothes and his tools and a few small items from the shelf. He picked up the photograph last. He held it for a moment before he placed it carefully in the front pocket of the bag. Dunn spoke from the doorway. "I don't want you to go," she said. Oren turned. He looked at her in the doorway, pale bronze scales, eyes steady, the slight tension in her jaw that meant she was holding herself together by concentration. He set the bag on the cot. "I know, little one," he said. She came into the room. She stood near the cot. She looked at the bag, then at him. "Will you be all right?" she asked. And it was such a strange thing for him to be asked, in such a genuine way, by something so much larger and more powerful than him in every measurable sense. He had been asked that question before, by co-workers after Lena, by the transit settlement housing officer when he was assigned to the new posting, by the medic who checked his arm after a work injury 3 years ago. It had always felt procedural, polite and hollow, like a form to be filled. Dunn was not filling a form. She was standing in a room she was not supposed to be in, having slipped past the guards at shift change, to ask him a question she needed the answer to. He smiled at her. It was the tired kind, the warm kind, the kind that does not perform anything. "Humans usually find a way," he said. "Don't worry about me." He looked at her for a moment. "You 3 are going to be fine. You know that. You're going to be better than fine." Dunn looked at him, and then something in her that had been very carefully managed all her life simply stopped managing itself. She stepped forward and put her arms around him. They barely reached around his torso. Her claws were careful, the way she was always careful with small things. She put her head against his shoulder. Oren stood still for 1 second. Then he put his arms around her. Gently, the way he held everything delicate, the hot pipe, the cracked housing seal, the photograph. He did not say anything else. She did not either. Vorath appeared in the doorway 40 seconds later. She had been doing her evening rounds, and the bunk room was on her route. She stopped. She looked at the 2 of them. She looked at the bag on the cot. Her expression did not change. It never changed. But she stood there for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she turned and walked on. She filed no additional report that night. The next morning, the reassignment order hit an administrative hold. Rail's petition had been logged and assigned a processing number, which meant the order could not be executed until the petition was evaluated. Sora's council inquiry had also been logged, which flagged all related reassignment actions for a review period. Together, the two filings had created a wall of paperwork that would take at minimum 2 weeks to resolve. And because the petition cited a specific incident involving the crèche's primary occupants, and because the council inquiry was filed by the heir to a warlord's house, the resolution could not be handled by the facility officer or by Vorath. It had to go up. All the way up. To the warlord himself. Oren was told by the morning shift clerk, who read it off a data pad with the enthusiasm of someone announcing a weather change, that his reassignment was on administrative hold pending senior review. He should continue his current assignment until further notice. He went back to work. He spent the morning checking the filter housings in the West Wing. He made a note about a valve cover that was starting to corrode at the edge. He ate his midday ration on the maintenance ledge and watched the light move across the black stone walls the way it always did in the afternoon. Above him, through the ceiling, in the main chamber, 3 hatchlings waited. High Warlord Dravan arrived without ceremony. That was the thing about truly powerful beings. They did not need to announce themselves with noise and preparation, because the world rearranged itself when they entered a room, and everyone in that room simply knew. He was enormous, twice the height of the largest guard in the crèche, with scales the color of deep space, nearly black, with a faint green iridescence that only showed when the light hit him at a certain angle. He had lived for 400 years. He had commanded the expansion that had reshaped a third of the known star systems. He did not walk as much as he moved through space, as if space was something he allowed to exist around him. He arrived mid-morning. He went directly to Vorath's office, spent 12 minutes reviewing the administrative record, and then called for each hatchling to be brought to the interview chamber one at a time. The chamber was not designed to be comfortable. It was a large, cold room with a single stone table and 2 chairs, one enormous, one small. The walls had no decoration. There was one window, high and narrow. Whatever happened in that room was between who was there and no one else. Rail went first. He walked in without being called a second time. He crossed the room and stood in front of the table. He did not perform the submission ritual, the lowering of the head, the drawing back of the wings, the particular posture that juniors were expected to hold before a ranking elder. He stood straight, met his father's eyes, and waited. Dravan looked at him for a long moment. He had not seen his son in 7 months. Children were managed by the crèche. He visited when the schedule allowed it, which was not often. "You filed a legal petition," Dravan said. His voice was low and even, like the sound of stone settling. "Yes," Rail said. "Explain your reasoning." Rail did not look away. The labor code permits a petition for protected status when a worker demonstrates critical competence that prevents harm to imperial assets or persons. The maintenance worker assigned here prevented the heating system from failing during a pressure crisis. The engineers confirmed his repair was solid. Removing him from the facility on a standard rotation schedule is not a strategic decision. It is an administrative reflex. "I made a strategic argument for his retention." "You cited his work as preventing harm to yourselves," Dravan said. "We are imperial assets," Rail said. "That is accurate." A pause. "You are the heir to this house," Dravan said, "not a labor administrator." "I am also," Rail said, "someone who watched a being with no proper tools, no physical advantages, and no obligation to succeed, hold a cracked pipe with a burning arm for 3 minutes because the alternative was that we got cold." He did not blink. "I have been taught to recognize strength. I recognized it. I acted accordingly." Dravan looked at his eldest child for a long time. He did not see softness. He saw precision, conviction, a young mind that had reached a conclusion and could defend it without flinching. He said nothing yet. He called for Sora. She came in the same way. She did everything controlled, measured, with the careful energy of someone who had rehearsed this without letting herself look rehearsed. She sat when offered the chair. She walked him through the council inquiry without being asked. She laid out the economic argument, the inefficiency of moving proven specialist labor to extraction facilities, the long-term cost modeling, the operational comparison data, the risk profile of the review period her inquiry had triggered. She spoke for 6 minutes without stopping, in the structured political language of the Dominion's administrative class. When she finished, she folded her hands in her lap and waited. Dravan considered her for a moment. "You did not mention the worker by name," he said. "No," she said. "But the inquiry concerns him." She met his gaze. "The inquiry concerns a system. He is a single case within that system. The argument stands without naming him. The argument also protects him more effectively without naming him, because a named individual can be dismissed as an exception. A systemic argument is harder to set aside." "You translated a personal interest into political language," Dravan said. Sora was very still. "I made an argument that holds on its own merits." "You also made it because you wanted to." She held his gaze. She did not confirm or deny it. She did not have to. She was the child of the most powerful political mind in 6 sectors, and he had just told her that he could read her exactly. The corner of Dravan's jaw moved, not quite a smile, something private and very small. He called for Dunn. She came in last. She walked to the table and stood in front of it, and she was visibly, completely terrified. Her pale scales were lighter than usual. Her tail was tucked. Her hands were clasped in front of her, but she did not run, and she did not look at the floor. She looked at her father. Dravan waited. He was very good at waiting. "I don't have an argument," Dunn said. Her voice was steady, which Dravan could tell was taking a great deal of work. "Rail has the legal argument. Sora has the political one. I don't have one of those." She stopped. She took a breath. "He taught me that grief doesn't mean you're broken," she said. "He carries something very heavy. He carries it every day, and he still comes to work, and he still fixes the things that are broken, and he was kind to me when nobody told him to be and nothing required it of him. He didn't do it because we were important. He didn't do it because he was afraid of us." She paused. "He did it because that's what he is." Dravan was very still. "I don't have a reason that fits an argument," Dunn said. "I just think that something that good shouldn't be thrown away." The room was quiet. Dravan looked at his youngest child, the one the assessment reports described as lacking aggression, showing low confidence, demonstrating uncertain leadership potential. She was standing in front of the most powerful being she had ever met, shaking very slightly, and she had just said exactly what she meant with no calculation and no armor. He had not thought she had that in her. He was not sure any of them had it the way she did. He looked at the 3 of them in his memory, in sequence. The eldest who had read the law and made a cold, strategic case that was genuinely correct. The middle one who had turned her feeling into a political instrument that would outlast this moment. The youngest who had simply told the truth. He thought briefly and without showing it about something very old, a being who had once been kind to him when he was young and frightened and learning what the Empire was. Not because they had to be, not because he was powerful. He had not been powerful then. He had been small and uncertain like Dunn, and a being had simply treated him as though that was enough to deserve consideration. He had not thought about it in over 300 years. He had built an empire and expanded it, and hardened himself into what an empire requires, and he had forgotten. He remembered now. He gave his ruling to Vorath in writing that afternoon, 4 sentences. The reassignment order was cancelled. The worker Oren was to receive a formal protected laborer designation within the facility. The designation was to be logged with the Central Labor Registry. A note was appended that the designation had been supported by valid petition from the senior occupants of the creche. Vorath processed it without comment. She filed the paperwork with the registry before the end of the day. Oren was informed by a clerk who found him in the West Corridor checking a valve cover. The clerk read the ruling off a data pad and handed him a printed copy which was the official record of the designation. Then the clerk left. Oren stood in the corridor with the document in his hand. He read it twice. It was written in formal Drachari administrative language, which he could mostly read after 11 years of working in their systems. It said, in essence, that he was not going anywhere. He folded the document carefully. He put it in his front pocket next to the photograph. Then he picked up his tools and went to check the valve cover he had noted in the morning. The corrosion at the edge was deeper than he had thought. He made a note to replace the cover at the next supply cycle. He treated the exposed metal with sealant compound so it would not spread in the meantime. He finished the job, logged the repair, and moved to the next one. In the main chamber above, 3 hatchlings were watching from the upper corridor window that looked out over the courtyard. They had found the angle earlier in the week by accident, and it had stayed useful. Oren crossed the courtyard below them with his toolbox in hand, head slightly down against the wind, moving at his usual pace, unhurried, efficient, going wherever the next task was. Rael watched him and said, "He does not even know what he did." Sora said, "He knows exactly what he did. He just doesn't think it was special." Dunn said nothing. She was watching him cross the courtyard. This man, who carried his grief in his front pocket and fixed things that were broken, and had never once in all his time in the creche asked for anything from them, or performed for them, or treated them like anything other than exactly what they were. She was smiling. She did not know, and neither did any of them, that Rael would carry this into every military decision he would ever make, the question of what genuine strength actually looked like, when it was not performing itself for an audience. That Sora would build an entire political philosophy around the moment she realized compassion could be translated into language that power understood, and that doing so was not cowardice but strategy. That Dunn, the overlooked one, would one day stand in front of the full Dominion Council and speak plainly about things the Empire did not want spoken plainly about, and she would be shaking the whole time, and she would do it anyway, because someone had taught her that shaking and still standing counted as standing. None of that was visible yet. It was still seed small, still tucked under the surface of 3 young dragons who were watching a maintenance worker cross a courtyard in the wind. Oren did not look up. He did not know they were there. He went through the far door and was gone. One human, no weapons, no strategy, no agenda. Just a man who had kept showing up and done his work and been decent without ceremony and carried his loss with both hands and kept moving. It was enough. It turned out, exactly enough.